Well, my apologies for not being Chuck Fager.
No apology required.
Well, thank you for that. As I'll mention again in just a minute, when Selma happened, I was far too young to be taken there. It would have been irresponsible on the part of my parents to take me to someplace that dangerous. So bear with me. Our text this morning is very familiar. 1 Corinthians 13 is a found poem. A found poem, in case you aren't familiar with that term, is what happens when someone recognizes the lyrical qualities of a pre-existing prose text and releases the underlying poetry. Sort of like the way Michelangelo talked about freeing the figures or sculptures that were imprisoned inside the marble. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have no love, I am like a booming gong or a clanging cymbal. If I am gifted with prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and I possess a faith that can move mountains, but have no love, I'm nothing. If I give all I have to the poor and deliver my body to be burned, but have no love, it gains me nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when completion comes, what is partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. For now we see but a dim reflection, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know partially, but then I shall know fully, just as I am fully known. So faith and hope and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Many of us think of this beautiful passage mostly as something to be read at weddings, or possibly on the Sunday before Valentine's Day. That quintessential folk holiday which is championed nowadays by the florists, chocolatiers, and greeting card companies. What we fail to recognize is that 1 Corinthians is one of the most currently relevant books in the entire New Testament. The ancient Greek city of Corinth had been destroyed by the Romans under Lucius Mummius in 146 BCE. The Romans killed all the adult men and sold all the women and children into slavery. The site of Corinth remained in ruins with no more than minimal habitation until Julius Caesar reestablished the city in 44 BCE, shortly before his assassination on the Ides of March. And he populated the place with freed slaves. Do you begin to see the parallels? When Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, a century later, the descendants of those freed slaves had been in Corinth for around 100 years, and it showed. To tell you the truth, it still shows nearly 2,000 years later. What I mean by this becomes much clearer when you remember the classic diagnosis of one of the major problems in the Corinthian church. It was riddled with factionalism. Paul brings this up at the beginning of his letter. It has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there is quarreling among you. What I mean is that each one of you says, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, that is Peter, or I belong to Christ. Is Christ divided? The congregation was heavily involved in status seeking, which is quite understandable when you look at our own history. The descendants of the freed slaves of ancient Corinth were, like their counterparts in the America of recent decades, trying to discover and establish their place in a society which probably had not done all that much on their ancestors' behalf once they'd been freed, other than found the city where they lived. At least for the Corinthians, unlike our own society over the past 160 years, there was an organized hostility or determined opposition to any movement of the former slaves towards social progress and equality. In place of the status seeking he found in the Corinthian church, Paul offers the ethic of radical love, or if you prefer the Greek, agape. It is true that the koine, or common Greek of Paul's day, had multiple terms for love, but it is also true that until its usage by Paul and the other authors of the New Testament, agape was rather a colorless term, meaning something like high regard or high esteem. The early Christians used agape as a translation of the Hebrew word chesed, which refers especially to the steadfast, faithful, and eternal love of God. Jesus points out that some of God's gifts, for example, the rising of the sun, or, here we go folks, rain for the crops, are given to the just and the unjust alike, without favoritism, which is, of course, God's chesed in action. And this is how we as Christians are meant to be. Love is patient. Love is kind. It is not self-seeking. Love never ends. At this point, though, we need to recognize a couple of things about the differences between the Corinthians' situation and ours. For one thing, Paul and that entire generation of Christians thought that the end of the world was just around the corner. So long-term social improvement wasn't really a concern for them. If the world's not going to be here tomorrow, why spend your time trying to make it a better place to live in if you're not going to be living in it past midnight or whenever. Only when it became clear that we would all be here a while, for a long while as it turned out, did what Judaism calls tikkun ha'olam, or repairing the world, start to assume its just importance in Christian thought. The Quaker version is from William Penn, of course. True godliness don't take men out of the world, but enables them to live better in it, and excites their best efforts to amend it. Another thing that we need to bear in mind is that there's a difference between self-seeking or insisting on your own way and working for justice and equality for everyone. The Quaker principle is that since God is no respecter of persons, neither should we be. There's a famous story in which William Penn is escorted into the presence of Charles II, and he doesn't remove his hat as was required by court etiquette. After exchanging pleasantries with Penn for a few minutes, Charles, whose antics with the ladies weren't the only reason he's called the Merry Monarch, removes his own hat. When Penn inquires why, Charles replies that since they were in the presence of the king, he felt that one of them ought to take his hat off, so he did. We Quakers are famous for what is often called our equality testimony, but it would probably be more accurate to speak of it in terms of radical egalitarianism. How many of you have ever been to a Jewish Seder? Just me? Not even an interfaith one? Okay. Well, at the Seder, or Passover meal, there's a reading about what are traditionally called the four sons, or the four children more recently, who represent different levels of understanding and styles of learning. The wise child asks you in detail about the observance, so you answer this child in terms that he or she can understand, and that's quite a lot. There's the wicked child who excludes him or herself by saying, "What is this the Lord your God has done for you?" The rabbis didn't like that one at all. They said that you take this kid in hand and you say, if you had been in Egypt, we'd have left you there because you excluded yourself from the community. There is the simple child who can barely stammer out, what is all this? So you give that child a simple answer. The fourth child is the one who doesn't even know how to ask about the meaning of the holy day, or is too young or otherwise unable to do so for some reason. Perhaps they've lost the power of speech due to illness, a stroke perhaps, or Alzheimer's. At any rate, these people are also part of the community and must be included. So you ask the four questions on their behalf and then explain the answers. Quakerism takes a similar view about inclusivity and the worth of the individual. Anyone who is here at this moment, from Sage and Ollie to, or someone even younger, if we had some, to the oldest one present, can be a vessel for the divine. Black, white, male, female, rich or poor. Any of us can recognize and then share that word of truth which enlightens us all. That's one reason why Quakerism traditionally avoids the use of titles. There are ways to show respect without the use of titles and flattery. Now, I know that some people in this country like to think that slavery ended a long time ago. But consider this. I had a great-grandmother who was born in 1891 and died when I was 39. A couple of her grandparents, who were born in the 1820s and 1830s, lived on until the 1920s. That means that I'm only two people away from the era of slavery. And most of the rest of you aren't much further, if you are any further at all. It was not that long ago. The Greensboro sit-ins happened just before I was born. The golden age of the civil rights movement happened when I was a child. If you look at it in those terms, none of it took place all that long ago. And there's much work to be done before Dr. King's dream is fulfilled. I've just recently learned that the original version of King's most famous speech didn't mention anything about a dream at all. He had struggled with that speech for a long while. After last week, I can empathize, and was still apparently not quite sure about it when he started addressing the multitude. After describing how they had all come to Washington on that hot day in August in order to collect on the promise which was made when the slaves were emancipated, King paused. In that moment, his good friend Mahalia Jackson, God bless her soul, Mahalia Jackson shouted out, "The dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." One of King's writers who was listening leaned over at just that moment and said, "These people don't know it yet, but they're about to go to church." And so Martin Luther King did tell them about the dream, entirely off script and from the depths of his soul. He'd been talking about it at least since the previous April. And the rest is history. Friends, I'm telling you that Martin Luther King's dream is one that has been shared through the ages by people of goodwill, whether or not they were also people of faith. Although I like to think that there certainly can be an extra dimension when they are people of faith. Martin Luther King and Mahalia Jackson were people of faith. Paul, whatever else we say about him, and most of us can find plenty to say, can't we, Cousin Mary, was a person of faith. George Fox and the early Friends were people of faith, and their faith included the belief that God is no respecter of persons, but is ready to accept people of all backgrounds. And that is part of the basis for our equality testimony. I don't know how many of you have read the book Roots. Show of hands. How many have read it? Or how many have seen, one or both of the miniseries? The ones back in the 70s and early 80s, yeah. I haven't seen the new one. The best story that Alex Haley includes in the book didn't even make it into that first miniseries. It made it into Roots: The Next Generations. Alex Haley had faith that he could use the bits and shreds of tradition that had been handed down to him and find the place where his people had come from back in Africa. Now, it has since transpired that Alex Haley was not all that good a genealogist, and not even Henry Louis Gates thinks that Haley found the exact village. But it doesn't matter, because the story that Haley recounts in the book that you see on film in the second miniseries is that he goes to Senegal. He goes up the Gambia River back to the village where the Kente clan are supposed to be strong. And he listens to a griot. If I'm not pronouncing that correctly, I crave your forgiveness. And the elder starts rattling off this long narrative, and then he gets to Then he gets to, Kunta Kinte was out, disappeared when he was out chopping wood for a drum one day and was never seen again. And you would have thought that a bomb goes off. Haley gets very excited and he grabs the attention of his interpreter and flips through his notebook and shows the notes to the interpreter, who tells the oral historian what's going on, and then the entire village descend on him en masse. They pick him up bodily and carry him to the local mosque. Everybody is in tears. They weep and they pray over him and thank Allah that Allah has brought back a son that was so long lost from their midst. That is the power of love. That is the sort of love that made Tertullian at the turn of the 3rd century remark that people of his day were attracted to join Christianity because they said, "See how these Christians love one another." To put into action the sort of love that Paul wrote about in 1 Corinthians 13 is to be about as much like God as it is possible to be in this life. So, in the opening words of 1 Corinthians 14, make love your goal. Amen. Mary, if you would